Hey everybody! Welcome to the conclusion of my Voddie Proves the Bible Again series. We left off last time with Voddie talking about how many times the New Testament manuscripts were copied, and me talking about how that has absolutely nothing to do with the truth of a claim. But Voddie, not having heard me because I was responding to recorded material and also probably not caring what I said as long as his audience didn't hear it, just treats the manuscript count as a settled indicator that the Bible's reliable, suggesting this really weird alternative that it would apparently force skeptics to retreat back to.
Yeah, well, but then we know that there's the whole overzealous monk theory, right?
And if you're an intelligent, well-adjusted person who is skeptical of the Bible for intelligent reasons, you might be asking yourself, what the f*** is the overzealous monk theory? That's because Voddie's not addressing any widely held reason people have for not believing the Bible. He's doing a lowbrow comedy routine where he concocts his own dumb reasons for not believing the Bible and then acts sarcastic about them to get laughs from Christians who are less interested in fine comedy than seeing skeptics get belittled. We've already seen this a couple times in this series.
So she looked at her professor and she said, I choose to believe the Bible because it's a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. They report supernatural events that took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies and claim that their writings are divine rather than human in origin.
And so the professor said, I'll have to get back to you. Problem. That's one of those contradictions in the Bible right there. Why? Well, because Judas hanged himself. How could he appear to the 12 if Judas hanged himself? He would only have appeared to 11 because Judas had already hanged himself. That's interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, that would appear to be a contradiction. Unless you read, like, the rest of the Bible.
And here we're about to watch him perform his longest, most outrageous, most clearly rehearsed one. How do I know it's rehearsed? Watch and see.
If we have these, monks during the time of Constantine who are going to go back and who are going to change the New Testament, they would have to find 6,000 Greek manuscripts and change them all the exact same way. Don't show your ink work, never tell anybody what you did. There's a second layer of problem. Jesus said, go and make disciples of pantata ethne, every people group. Problem with people groups is they speak different languages. So within the first couple of centuries, the New Testament is translated into Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. So now, overzealous monks have to go find 6,000 manuscripts, change them all the exact same way, don't show your ink work, don't get caught. There's a third layer of problem. The early church fathers had this horrible habit of quoting and writing commentaries on the New Testament, so much so that if all we had were...
Now, one really interesting thing about this is that Voddie seems to have developed some awareness of the fact that this is a straw man and that he comes off as a total horse's ass pretending it's a position of skeptics. Because in my original series, he played this completely straight, prompting me to respond,
yeah, nobody believes what you just said, Voddie, and you know they don't.
Yet this time he opens with a really interesting disclaimer. I originally skipped past it to get right to the routine itself, but it's worth listening to.
And that it's these monks and it's this Constantine guy. Again, that's more Dan Brown than it is, okay? That's Da Vinci Code, that's the movies. That's not actual history. But even if we were to go there, okay, there's a few problems.
So this is odd, right? Voddie's totally aware that this whole conspiracy theory is just something from a movie that's not even taken seriously by historians. Indeed, he acknowledges as much, but then just says, even if we were to go there, and then spends over 2.5 minutes summing it up and making fun of how ridiculous it is. This is incredibly bizarre, and I can only think of a couple reasons he'd do this. The first is that he was originally either so sloppy he thought the overzealous monk theory was real or so dishonest he knowingly passed it off as real but eventually got corrected or called out, yet by then this was already an established part of his routine that filled a couple minutes and got a good laugh out of his audience, so instead of getting rid of it, he kept it but opened with, by the way, this isn't real history, but just roll with me. Second, he knows that even after rattling off an obligatory acknowledgement that this isn't a serious position taken by historians, he can still represent it to his audience as something a vaguely defined portion of the world uses to avoid belief in the Bible. And judging by the energy of the room as this absurd exercise unfolded, it seemed to work. This opens a whole can of worms about the relationship between apologists and their audiences and what they cooperate with each other to do. It's interesting, and incredibly sad, That a pantomime about belief in Christianity being obvious and worldly people being silly for missing how obvious it is feels such a deep need for an apologetic audience that they just lap it up, even after the speaker finished telling them it's just a movie narrative. If this doesn't remove any doubt about the thinly veiled carnival act Voddie is putting on for his audience, then nothing will.
So we have a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses.
The carefully selected anthology of documents from within the same religious tradition, written by people who predictably swear up and down that they totally saw stuff while making vague allusions to other mostly unnamed people who they say also totally saw the same thing.
All right? So far, we just got a good history book.
If by good history book you mean the writings of a tight-knit first-century cult that was on an overtly stated evangelistic mission,
now it gets good. Verse 17. For when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased," we ourselves heard this very voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain. Now we have a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses, and they report supernatural events. Let's say that together. We have a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses, and they report supernatural events.
The carefully selected anthology of documents from within the same religious tradition, written by people who predictably swear up and down that they totally saw stuff while making vague allusions to other mostly unnamed people who they say also totally saw the same thing, and by the way, the stuff they claimed is batshit crazy. Not sure what that last part gets you, Voddie, but okay.
Not superhuman events. Superhuman events, that's like sports highlights, okay? These are supernatural events.
So basically it's like sports highlights, but these are even less believable. And unlike sports highlights, they're not caught on film.
They're talking about the Mount of Transfiguration. They're talking about when Jesus was transfigured on the mountain, and he was visited. And he saw Moses, Elijah, and Peter said, "We just need to build some stuff right here and never leave." This was awesome. The Bible is not just a bunch of rules about religion. The Bible is a collection of supernatural events. These men claim that Jesus healed the sick. These men claim that Jesus walked on the water. And the pièce de résistance, Friday, he was dead. Sunday, he was risen. These are not just the writings of a religious community trying to pass down their rules and regulations.
Correct. It's a religious community trying to pass down their rules and regulations and their supernatural claims. What's baffling to me here is not only that Voddie thinks the Bible's supernatural claims make it more believable, because seriously? But that he can pass off the fact that its authors spiced up their teachings with magic stories as something unique that makes the Bible stand out. That's the most mundane thing religions do. Hell, it's pretty much a defining activity of religion. So, what point is he even supposed to be making? He goes on to give examples of how the Bible has supernatural tales, as if a case had to be made for this, before transitioning into prophecy.
But not only are they supernatural events, but they're supernatural events that took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies. We're not talking about general Nostradamus type prophecies, okay? We're not talking about faith healer prophecies. Doesn't take a whole lot for me. If I just know anything about the human condition, I know. There's somebody in this room and you're suffering from a back condition, right? There's somebody in this room and you lost your job not long ago. There's somebody, in a room this size, that's not what I'm talking about here.
Here we're seeing Voddie use the same strategy he employed in part 1 when discussing reasons to believe the Bible, as he explains to his audience how silly fortune-telling works, not to teach them healthy skepticism, but to show them he's aware of the kind of stuff skeptics debunk, indeed that he joins them in laughing at it, and thus that whatever he's about to propose is likely better than that. But I don't find the fact that someone knows charlatans exist and tells me they're better automatically impressive. Indeed, how many mediums won't acknowledge that there are a lot of frauds out there, but they're not one of them? How many multi-level marketers will warn you about all the other people running pyramid schemes and explain that they're different? It's basically part of the script if you're running a scam on a moderately literate audience that wants to feel like it's above being fooled. So before we move on, it's worth looking directly at Voddie's examples of bad prophecy and seeing how they contrast with a more impressive example. Then when he shows us a prophecy from the Bible, we can see which it more closely resembles. His examples, someone suffering from a bad condition or somebody lost their job not long ago, are clearly vague and so broad they're obviously going to apply to somebody in any reasonably sized audience, right? They're devoid of any specific information, including names, dates, or deadlines, and the psychic is counting on an audience member to feed these kinds of details into their malleable generalization. Then the audience automatically associates all these details with the original statement, giving the impression the psychic said way more than they actually did. It's pretty classic stuff, right? A much more impressive example would be something like, Jim Johnson was terminated from his position as a teller at First National Bank last August after being late for the third time in 6 months. That has actual information the psychic couldn't have easily guessed, and it commits to details that are hard to backpedal from. Let's keep these two kinds of statements in mind when Voddie offers examples of biblical prophecies.
That's not the kind of prophecies that I'm talking about. The kind of predictive prophecies that I'm talking about. I'm talking about, for example, the prophecies in Isaiah 53, for example. In Isaiah 53, Isaiah, over 700 years before Jesus was born, prophesies that Jesus will be born and that he will be the suffering servant. Isaiah 53 is a powerful passage.
Just to give you a heads up, Voddie doesn't even say anything about Isaiah 53. He just carries on about how the Jewish people are so afraid of the chapter that they skip it. You know, because it's so clearly a prophecy about Jesus and they don't want to acknowledge him. And of course there's an anecdote about how a Christian visiting Israel showed it to someone there and they got mad because it proved Jesus. It's pretty puerile and insulting stuff. If the prophecy were as open and shut as he's saying, why would he need to lean on these stupid stories instead of just showing us the prophecy? And where on earth would Voddie get the idea to tell stories of Jews getting owned in arguments so bad they just rage quit the conversation? Oh yeah, maybe he got it from how the Gospels depict every encounter between Jesus and the Pharisees and Sadducees. Anyway, let's skip to where he actually gets down to business and explains how part of the Old Testament, Psalm 22, supposedly predicts Jesus' death. For context, this psalm depicts someone calling out to God in desperation, probably a ruler on the run from his enemies in what sounds like a civil war. It's important to keep in mind what the passage as a whole is actually saying when someone tries to make individual snippets sound like they're about Jesus.
Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me from the words of my groaning? Oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest.
So Psalm 22 says, My God, why have you forsaken me? Which is what Jesus says on the cross. Fair enough, but prophecy? We'll get to that later. Also, the part about the character persistently crying out to God day and night and wondering why he's not being saved doesn't seem to fit quite as well.
Look at verse 6. I am a worm and not a man, scorned by mankind and despised by the people. All those who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. He trusts in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him rescue him, for he delights in him. That's what's being said to Jesus. That's how he's being mocked while he's being crucified.
So Jesus and the psalmist were mocked in somewhat similar ways. This is fine but not super mind-blowing, and definitely not a way to predict the crucifixion of Jesus.
Go down to verse 12. Many bulls have encompassed me. Strong bulls of Bashan surround me. They open wide their mouths at me like a ravening and roaring lion. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. Why? Because you're nailed to a tree.
So the psalmist, who's being hounded by his enemies, says his bones are all out of joint, almost certainly as a figure of speech to express weariness. Since, all his bones literally being out of joint is pretty implausible. Nothing, by the way, is said of being nailed to a tree, and the Gospels don't depict Jesus' bones being out of joint.
My heart is like wax. It is melted within my breast. Interesting. After he dies, they pierce him in the side, thrusting upwardly. They pierce the pericardium, and blood and water rush out.
So the psalmist says his heart is melting, an obvious figure of speech for being afraid, and it's here that we see Voddie make perhaps his biggest leap. Because not only is being stabbed in the heart not the same as your heart melting, but the Bible never says the spear was thrust upward into Jesus' heart. It just says, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water, and Christians impose their modern scientific knowledge onto the text by just brazenly making up the part about the spear piercing his pericardium to release its water, even though the pericardium only has a few milliliters in it, which would barely even dilute the blood that was flowing out of the body, much less produce what the soldiers would imprecisely perceive as a sudden flow of blood and water.
Look at the next this. My strength is dried up like potsherd. My tongue sticks to my jaws, which would make you say, I thirst.
The psalm depicts someone being thirsty, and, Jesus was also depicted being thirsty on the cross. Great, I guess. And not thirsty like that, you perverts.
You lay me in the dust of death. Verse 16, for dogs encompass me. That is a reference to Gentiles. Guess what Roman soldiers are? Gentiles.
The psalmist was surrounded by dogs, probably because he was on the run or something. Jesus was surrounded by Romans, not dogs, so Voddie tries to impose an after-the-fact connection onto these passages using an ancient slur to describe Gentiles.
A company of evildoers encircles me. He's crucified between two of them.
The psalmist was encircled by evildoers. Jesus was crucified between two criminals, which, not only would this be a vague connection if Jesus were encircled, but he wasn't. Because, having a person on either side of you isn't what being encircled means. Like, at all. This is just sad.
They have pierced my hands and feet. By the way, not everyone who was crucified was pierced in the hands and feet. Some were just tied to the cross so that it took days for them to die.
The psalmist says evildoers pierced his hands and feet, or some texts say pierced him like a lion, which makes more sense but I guess robs the people who read it of the prophecy, and Jesus' hands and feet were pierced on the cross. This is admittedly more compelling than some of the ludicrousness we've been seeing, but still, would it convey Jesus dying on the cross to an ancient Israelite? Or just give a piece of imagery people could cherry pick and connect after the fact?
I can count all my bones. They break your bones in order to hasten your death. Jesus was crucified right before a high holy day. He needed to die quickly so that his body wasn't hanging on the cross during the Passover. But they didn't have to break his bones because he said, into thy hands I commit my spirit. So none of his bones were broken when he was crucified.
The psalmist says he can count all his bones, almost certainly a colorful way of expressing his weariness, not a declaration of his anatomical knowledge, and the Romans apparently didn't break Jesus' legs, which in no way has anything to do with the expression.
They stare and gloat over me, and they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. That was written 1,000 years before Jesus was ever born, and it was written by a man who never once in his lifetime saw a crucifixion. Well, how do you know? Because crucifixion had not yet been invented. That's how I know.
Yes, this may have been written by someone who never saw a crucifixion. And I say may have because we don't know exactly when people started crucifying each other, but the practice predates the Romans by centuries. Regardless, though, why do we care whether or not he knew about them? Because he never described anything even resembling one. Seriously, put yourself in the shoes of an ancient Israelite who just read Psalm 22. Would you walk away from it knowing what a crucifixion was? More to the point, would this convey the story or significance of Jesus' crucifixion? No, because Voddie's abuse of Psalm 22 is remarkably similar to his examples of bad fortune-telling in terms of not conveying information. Just as the words, somebody lost their job not long ago doesn't tell the story of Jim Johnson getting fired from a bank, or even as much as inform the audience that Jim Johnson exists, the text of Psalm 22 doesn't tell the story of Jesus dying on a cross, and a person could read it over and over and over without knowing the first thing about Jesus. And just as the psychic needs to hear the story of Jim Johnson from an outside source and connect it back to his generalization, Voddie needs to take the story of Jesus from the Gospels and connect it back to the Psalm. In either case, the prophecy doesn't predict anything ahead of time, the supposed function of prophecy, and the fraud doing this little trick counts on you to associate the initial story with the new information they imported into it after the fact. Now yes, Psalm 22 has more detail than the phrase, somebody lost their job, but at least that phrase communicates the overall idea of what it's supposed to be predicting, whereas Psalm 22 does not. It's just a completely unrelated story of someone being hounded by his enemies, and the only thing supposedly connecting it to Jesus is a scattering of details so tenuously related that the apologists have to fish them out and laboriously explain them even to an audience already familiar with the Gospels. These details amount to 4 moderately interesting similarities between the stories, 4 similarities that are either incredibly generic or don't even exist until Voddie strains figures of speech to the breaking point, and 2 connections that don't exist at all because for one, Voddie used the word encircled in a way that's not even semantically defensible, and for the other he just flatly added information that's not in the gospel story to make a connection that would be tenuous even if it were. But then, okay, what do we do with the 4 moderately interesting connections? I mean, they clearly don't predict Jesus' crucifixion to an ancient audience, but how did this author know that Jesus would say, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" or that people would cast lots for his clothing? Well, here's the thing. Maybe he didn't. I mean, why is it even useful to theorize that he did, when we have a way more likely explanation, which is that, oh, let's see, maybe the gospel writers were aware of Psalm 22 and alluded to it. This shows why this whole thing is just silly. If 2 stories are similar, and the person who wrote the second had every opportunity to be familiar with the first one, then why are we even talking about prophecy? The fact that Voddie considers this proof of prophecy just shows how audaciously empty his whole routine is, regardless of how similar the stories might be. This pretty much concludes the actual arguments of Voddie's presentation, and from here he largely devolves into rambling sentiment, as sermons often do at the end. However, he does say a couple things that illustrate just how obviously full of shit he is. First is this.
And oftentimes you have individuals who say, well, I just can't get there. I can't go there. Why? Because men wrote that. Men wrote that, and I just can't believe it. Then you can't believe anything written in any book. Because men wrote them.
But nobody who says men wrote the Bible are saying we should automatically reject everything people write. They're just saying the Bible needs to be fairly scrutinized like everything else people write. Voddie should know better, and this just makes him sound stupid or manipulative. Next, he continues,
but there's another problem. This whole idea that we have. And I've had people say this. Yeah, well, I'm a man of science. And unless these types of things can be proven to me scientifically, then when people say that, I just want to give them a hug.
And I guess this patronizing response is better than last time when he got mad and said he was about to beat them like a tied-up goat. I really hope he doesn't have any pets.
I really do. I really do. Because they believe that they're so super intelligent and they're demonstrating their ignorance. I just want to hug them. I just want to put my arm around them and say, listen. I'm telling you this because I'm your friend. Don't ever say that to anybody else. Because you do sound like an idiot. What do you mean? Well, the scientific method. You understand the scientific method? Well, yes. In the scientific method, something has to be observable, measurable, and repeatable. Right? History is not observable, measurable, or repeatable. You don't use the scientific method to prove historical events. So if you say you need scientific evidence for this, you sound like an idiot.
For all Voddie's syrupy condescension, this at best is launching a nuclear bomb at a figure of speech for not being totally precise, and at worst it reeks of creationist misconception that you have to repeat the actual past to study it scientifically. After a bit more rambling, he concludes,
the intelligent man says, I choose to believe the Bible because it's a reliable collection of historical documents written by eyewitnesses during the lifetime of other eyewitnesses. They report supernatural events that took place in fulfillment of specific prophecies, and they claim that their writings are divine rather than human in origin.
So according to Voddie, an intelligent man will choose to believe the Bible because it's a carefully selected anthology of documents from within the same religious tradition, written by people who predictably swear up and down that they totally saw stuff while making vague allusions to other mostly unnamed people who they say also totally saw the same thing. And by the way, the stuff they claimed is batshit crazy, but I count it as prophecy when a later author who's aware of an earlier author alludes to something in his work, and also find someone more not less believable when they say God told them to say something. And apparently he'll believe it to the extent of taking every word as inerrant. Cool. I think by now Voddie's thoroughly demonstrated that he's full of shit, probably full of shit on purpose, and the evangelicals who believe him are too invested in belief and often border on letting themselves be fooled. I wish I had a more elegant way to wrap this up, but I can't think of one. If you're a Christian who listens to stuff like this and somewhere deep down inside you feel bothered by it, pay attention to that internal voice. And if you're a skeptic who gets cornered by people repeating stuff like this, I hope my videos give you at least a few explicit things to say when you're put on the spot. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, Precipitating Pisces 250, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.